Boundaries have nothing to do with whether you love someone or not. They are not judgments, punishments, or betrayals. They are a purely peaceable thing. The basic principles you identify for yourself that define the behaviours you will tolerate from others, as well as the responses you will have to those behaviours. Boundaries teach people how to treat you, and they teach you how to respect yourself.
Quick! Is anyone here a doctor? Yes, her name is Dr. Emily, and she's a psychologist. Please welcome to the Imperfects, our very own psychologist! Dr. Emily, back in the studio, psychologist.
Not our psychologist, a psychologist who, and a very dear friend of ours who comes here every month, and she picks out a favourite part of an episode that she wants to digest with us and explore and learn from.
Well, she teaches us.
Yeah, we learn.
We learn, she teaches from a clinical place.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be fair to say, Dr. M?
Yes, I definitely hope so. Yeah.
It would be very fair to say. It would be accurate to say as well.
Looking extra clinical with your iPad in front of you with notes today.
I know, I'm good to go.
Okay, wow.
Maybe I was just thinking about what you use for notes, your Remarkable. So it's called Remarkable, is that right?
Yeah.
What a great name for it.
Yeah, for a marking device. Yeah. It's
very good.
Yeah, it's great. I love my Remarkable.
I feel like they thought of it and then had to make it because of, it's like when I was over the summer holidays, I saw just a leaflet at a cafe down the beach, and it was a guy's business, and it was a guttering business, and it was called Absolutely Gutted.
Oh.
And I felt like he came up with that name and went, now I've got to do it.
Yeah. I mean, the other potential use for Remarkable is if someone started a cable company and it's like the Remarkable.
Oh, yeah.
That would also be a possibility because it's with a C instead of a K. So any cable manufacturers out there looking for a name, have it. Well, give me $20. Why not? You know?
A lobster for your troubles.
A lobster for your troubles.
20. Yeah.
Yes. Nice.
Colloquial. Anyway.
It is. I thought it was another name of a
No,
business.
let's keep talking about colloquialisms. Let's not talk to M yet. That's what people tuned in for. Colloquialisms.
What do people call $10 notes?
Oh, blueies?
Kermit?
Blue.
No, Kermit. Is Kermit? No.
I thought it was a Guy
Kermit's
McKenna.
10. Yeah, Guy McKenna.
A tenner. A Guy McKenna.
Anyway.
It's all good stuff.
Okay, Dr. M, this is ridiculous. Let's actually talk about what everyone's tuned in for. So like you mentioned, when you come on the podcast, you bring in something from a previous episode of ours and you elaborate in some clinical way. What episode do you want to expand on today?
So I wanted to take a look back at Grant Denier's episode.
Oh, yeah. Grant Denier, that was amazing. Yeah.
Such a powerful episode, really.
Could be used for a $10 note as well. Grant Tenure.
Yeah. So,
yes.
Em, you were saying?
So,
How much does that cost? A denier.
Denier. Oh, yeah.
Sort of.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I wanted to talk about boundaries, and there's a particular excerpt from his episode. It kind of struck me as I was listening to it that there was, this kind of really highlighting our general struggles with boundaries. And I'll explain what I mean by boundaries as we go along.
Because that is a term that you hear talked about a lot, boundaries. And often I think I get it, but I don't think I actually do.
Yeah.
I desperately need to listen to you in the next however long you speak for.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're here now. You may as well.
No, there's desperation about the way I'll be listening.
I have to say at the top of this too that I have a therapist, as all good psychologists should have a therapist, I suppose. And if she was listening, and I hope that she doesn't, she would probably say, Emily, this is definitely a topic for you also.
Okay.
So I think it's important to acknowledge that this is something that, I definitely work with and in my practice. And it's also something that I pay attention to for my own personal tendencies too. Yeah.
That's fascinating. So do you, when you're in clinic and when you're the psychologist, would it often happen where a client, or do you call them a client, patient, client, would talk about something in regards to boundaries and you go like, oh, I'm resonating with that. That is, yep, that's me. How do you, if you're if you're dealing with it as well in your own way, I mean, I know you're not necessarily always giving advice, but that is that sort of a strange position to be in where it's
Yeah, look, I think it's important to acknowledge like the human in the room that, I get it. Boundaries are hard. And I really empathize with how hard this feels to be able to assert and, bring to awareness what your boundaries are. I personally wouldn't really go into a lot of personal anecdotes in my therapy with other people about my experience. I don't think that's helpful. But I think it's helpful that, like, to be honest, that people in my therapy sessions don't feel like I'm the expert standing at the top of the mountain watching you trying to get up to the top of the mountain. Like, I'm really kind of walking with you in this kind of being human thing.
crazy thing called life, am I right?
Yep.
Yeah. I hear you. It ain't easy.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. So boundaries. This is from Grant Denya's episode, which we'll link to in the show notes. It's one of the most popular and most incredible episodes that we did last year. So you should, if you haven't listened to that, or you have, listen to it again or for the first time.
I remember doing all that travel for Sunrise, and then just getting to the end of realising that I'd gone past empty. I'm now into my reserves. It's getting dangerous now, how exhausted I was. I remember going to the doctor, and the doctor said, your organs are running at about 7%. He said, you're gonna die if you keep going like this. And I remember going to the network and saying, look, I can't do this anymore. I have to leave.
Is this the weather?
Yeah. And it was raining its tits off. The weather was, an important part of the show, and you could see the audience liked it because there were audience spikes, in that little 5-minute segment after the news all the time. And the CEO was like, mate, can you just do one more year? Just one more year, just for me, mate, just for me. And I'm like, I don't think I can. Come on, mate, just as a friend. So then you go, okay, I'll give you one more. And then you get to the end of that year. Come on, mate, just one more. Can you do another one? And I'm like, okay. I ended up giving them 3. And then it got to the point where no one was listening. No one really cared how I was going. And I clearly wasn't very well. And me being me, I'm trying to give it 1,000%. How do I make the last broadcast that I did 25 minutes ago better than, how do I make this one better than the last one? And every time I was trying to opt out, every time I was trying to put the white flag up and say, I can't do it anymore, I have to stop. I was coaxed into doing it again, and no one was checking on my welfare, and I just got to a point where I had to just cut and run. So I just decided, the situation wasn't going to change because there was too much riding on it unless I changed it. And so I just announced it one morning on Sunrise and just said, guys, I'm out. I can't do it anymore. No one was listening. No one wanted to hear that I wanted to hang up, my weather boots.
So did you announce this like on air or?
Yeah, just announced it on air, yeah.
Because you probably felt like I have to.
Yeah, that was the only option. No one was listening to anything else, and no one wanted to help. No one, not one person said, "Are you okay?"
Wow, so that's obviously Grant Denya talking about the end of his time on Sunrise as the weather guy. Wowee, I mean, that was a really powerful moment. I remember that. Yeah.
It's really moving listening to it. Really, you really get the full sense of just like utter depletion and exhaustion, like almost this kind of crisis point. But there was something really important that he said, obviously, at the end, and that is that he made the choice himself and that he took himself out of that because the consequences at that point were far too much for him to continue. I guess it really stuck out to me about how we work with our own boundaries, what our boundaries are and how we assert them. So I thought we could spend some time kind of exploring that. And I also really want to note, and this is definitely not the main point of this episode, but I think it's one point maybe towards the end about how we are as individuals accepting other people's no's. So how we go about kindly and appropriately accepting that someone has said no.
So it's essentially when someone sets a boundary.
How we respond to people setting boundaries.
Yeah.
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 Right.
This may be too broad of a question, but what is a boundary?
Okay, great. And this is why I have my iPad here, because I wanted to read this quote. It's way too long for me to remember. But I think in my mind, it actually really defines what boundaries are. And I will go into more detail. But there is an American writer whose name is Cheryl Strayed, and she's actually the writer who wrote Wild. There was the movie with Reese Witherspoon.
Yeah.
And she is also the person that actually trekked through the American wilderness. So she's quite a prolific writer, very accomplished. And she has an amazing quote on boundaries. And so I'm going to read it to you. Okay. It's such a cliche, sweet peas, but it's true. You must set boundaries. Fucked up people will tell you otherwise, but boundaries have nothing to do with whether you love someone or not. They are not judgments, punishments, or betrayals. They are a purely peaceable thing. The basic principles you identify for yourself that define the behaviours you will tolerate from others, as well as the responses you will have to those behaviours. Boundaries teach people how to treat you, and they teach you how to respect yourself.
Especially, I love that last line in particular. Teach you how to respect yourself.
Yes, 100%. And I think at its heart, what we're looking at here is how we're treating ourselves in our relationships, in our environments, in our workplaces, as parents, as children.
So it really is like a boundary is a way to protect yourself. Is that fair to say?
Yes, it's in some ways it's but what is protected and what is shared. So a boundary, I mean, obviously if you think about it from the very physical sense of the word, it's a line. So it's a division between myself and the world. And sometimes also we can see that we have internal boundaries with ourselves as well, which I'll come to. But in essence, they are the rules and expectations that we have about how we navigate our interactions in the world.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
To me, the first thing I think about is something I'm trying very hard to do this year is protect your energy. Like that's what it feels. That's what this feels like to me. It's like a way of protecting energy.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking protection as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. So if we think about, so what does this actually look like? Why are they important? Why are they a problem? Maybe I might actually throw over to you guys and get a sense of like, how do you know if you have a problem with boundaries?
Oh, how do you know?
Well, for me, it's when I'm doing something I find myself doing something I don't want to do.
Yeah.
And resenting it.
Yeah. I'm resenting. Exactly. And it's like when I've been asked to do it, my gut reaction is, I don't want to do that. I don't want to say no to these people, so I'll just say yes. And then when you're actually doing it or on the way there to do it, you're just like, I should not be doing this. But I mean, the context of my life is this year I really want to, I'm trying to protect as much energy as I can for my family. That's who I want to have the energy for. And there's the podcast and the Resilience Project and there's running, and that's kind of they're the things I'm doing this year. And I've never been good at protecting that space because I'm horrible. I'm like, yeah, I'll do that even though I don't want to. Yep, I can do that. And so, yeah, it's my internal thing is like, if I don't want to do it, then and you say yes, you're letting people walk all over your boundaries. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's a great example. Yeah.
Yeah, mine, same. Yeah, I guess it's like, I mean, it's obviously not the protecting myself for my family, energy for the family. I don't have like kids and stuff, but yeah, it's the committing to something because you don't want to either hurt the person's feelings or even I say yes to something because I feel like, I should do it. It's the should versus do I really want to do it? And then, yeah, find myself doing, I'm like, oh God, I've committed to this thing and it means that I now can't do this other thing that I really, really want to do. Or it means that I have to do something rather than nothing, which I really need.
Yeah. I think that means all spot on, and there's some really important kind of themes that are coming out of just those anecdotes there. And I do really want to go into them in terms of, kind of what gets in the way of us setting boundaries. I think, from my point of view, it's important that we have a look at, okay, so where are boundaries? Where do we need them? What do they look like? There is an amazing book called Set Boundaries, Find Peace by an American author called Nedra Tawwab, and she has also an amazing Instagram account where she has like lots of really good little tidbits on boundary setting. And she identifies that there are really kind of 3 kinds of experiences with boundaries. The first is a porous boundary. And so that means basically that there's almost like there's no division between you and me almost. Mm-hmm. That it's as though it's like a lot of openness in some ways. And that would look like things like people pleasing, oversharing, enmeshment, which I'll come back to. It looks like saying yes when you want to say no. Mm-hmm. So it's almost as though those boundaries are so flexible that I will do almost anything, basically. Mm-hmm. Does that kind of make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then we've got rigid boundaries. Now, rigid are obviously like totally inflexible. They tend to be really concrete, almost like just a non-negotiable. And it might sound like that's a really helpful thing, but in some circumstances, having a really rigid boundary is not always helpful. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it might be something like if you have a really rigid boundary around socialising at work, there might be a particularly important social function that is for work, and you're like, no, I don't do social. Mm-hmm. I don't do social events. Yeah. And that might feel like an important boundary that you're setting there, but it is maybe at times is that coming at a cost to your sense of well-being. Mm. So the rigid boundaries in some ways are there to keep us protected from pain. So I don't do these things. And that might look like someone who's a bit more cold, a bit more withdrawn, more distant, the kind of like even almost like the colleague that you really don't know anything about. Mm. They come in and they do their work and then they go.
Yeah.
So that might be an example of like a rigid boundary.
When it feels like it's kind of bleeding into the episode you did on social anxiety, where it's almost like setting a rigid boundary mm-hmm. about social things at work could be a safety behavior.
Yeah, definitely.
It could be sort of the thing that stops you from actually exposing yourself
mm-hmm.
to the thing that you need.
Yes.
Good
exactly.
memory.
Good.
Mm.
Top
Thanks.
marks. Top marks, right?
Yeah. That's right. I listened to Em's episodes heaps, so just remember them.
Recall them all.
Yeah.
And the other obvious one is healthy boundaries. And so this is where we can, first of all, and this is so key, you have an awareness of what your boundaries are and when and where you need them. So that's a healthy boundary, is knowing, first of all, knowing, mm-hmm. awareness. And the second part to this is that you can communicate the boundary and you take action with the boundary. Yep.
Are these boundaries all, do people have, is it split up as in like that person only has porous boundaries and that person only has rigid, or is it more like in my life I'll have some boundaries that are rigid, some that are porous and some that are healthy?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. What does the word porous mean?
Like things can soak through, like a porous boundary on a, what would be
I just think of like a porous tennis court. The things like soak in.
Soak in,
I don't know.
like a,
right, okay, yeah,
a porous membrane can absorb things from
mm-hmm.
outside.
Okay.
Yeah, as opposed to like a sealed
concrete.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like the way I actually think of porous actually is more like a piece of seaweed in the ocean. It's like it just like gets like flown around in with the currents and the tides.
Yeah.
And a rigid would be like a stick in the sand. Mm-hmm. And I guess we want to kind of find somewhere in the middle. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there are different kind of domains of boundaries. And the one I think that we're all really familiar with, and I think the one that probably we mostly struggle with, is time. So boundaries with time. So the big one that comes out there is like requests for your time. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, time. I mean, I think the thing that's coming to my mind, sorry to cut you off, Em, but the thing that's coming to mind immediately is I don't know if you'd necessarily call it a boundary, or you told me maybe it is a boundary, is that I don't ever want to be late. Like I hate being late.
You and Hugh both.
Yeah, cool. Ironic high five. But I hate being late. I sometimes am. But I think what I have like in my mind probably a rigid boundary of like I don't want to be late. I don't want to let down the person that I made the commitment to. So then if Jam and I are going somewhere and we're going there together, and she's stressing about something at home, like she can't find something, and so we're not able to leave when I wanted to leave, I'm not there for her at home. I'm not supporting her because in my mind I'm like, if you don't find that thing, you're going to make me break my boundary and I'll be disappointed. But as a result, I'm not there for her properly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's like there's a rigid boundary there for you. We can also say, like, when we're thinking more broadly around time, it's really kind of people making requests of you, and how you then negotiate and navigate your experience with the time you have in general.
Yeah.
So that will be like you come into work and someone asks you to do this particular thing. And really interestingly, and here you said it, there is like a pause there when you know the boundary's been crossed. And that is the, okay. So that sigh, that like internal groan, there's your boundary. That's almost like this is really, really important information here is there is something that is challenging my boundary. And when I say yes, I've crossed it.
Really good.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So time is a really, really common struggle for a lot of people, and that ties into a whole lot of things, which I will come to. So there's that. There's also physical boundaries, and this is like obviously a really obvious one. So we all have, and this I should mention this actually, what is a boundary for me may not be a boundary for you. So we all have our own unique boundaries, and they will be informed obviously by our learning histories, our early experiences, how our parents have modelled to us boundaries, things like that. So when it comes to physical touch or a physical space, it is very much unique. And I think that that's a really important thing to pay attention to. And I mean, you notice this like really easily with little kids. And this is such a common experience, I think. Go and give Grandma Shelley a hug. I don't want to give her a hug. I don't want to give her a hug. And you're like, that's the child's boundary, right? So when we force them to go and give the hug, in some ways, we are violating their internal boundaries. Okay. So we have to work with that in a different way. We have to offer alternatives. We don't need to be rude, but we can say, let's say goodbye in a different way. Let's give a high five or a wave or a wink. Yeah. But even as young as as children, we intuitively have a sense in some ways of our boundaries and what feels uncomfortable. So we can even kind of use this like, what feels uncomfortable for me?
Yeah.
And so it may be like you might have people who, people that don't have a sense of physical space. So they're the ones that might lean in a lot in your conversation.
It's
and you
the
intuitively.
close talker in Seinfeld,
Exactly, yep. And you intuitively find yourself without even thinking about it, like moving back.
Yeah.
Or trying to find, like in essence, your zone of comfort.
I'm often in those situations, if I'm talking to someone like that, I often think, you know how you realise, I'm like, we've moved 3 meters.
Yeah. In a room.
And it's not their way. We're going my way. And I often think, I wonder how far around we could move.
End up in a different room.
Yeah.
So that's like almost like a very passive assertion of your boundaries is like, I'm not going to verbalize that you're getting too close. This is like, I'm finding a way for me to recreate my boundary there. Obviously, there's a whole lot of trauma tied up in violations of physical boundaries. If we think about obviously the experiences of early childhood abuse or any kind of experience of sexual trauma, this is a fundamental violation of a physical boundary. In addition to other things, but that boundary has been significantly and severely violated. But on a kind of a more simple level, we can just see it in terms of how comfortable we are with even public displays of affection. Some people are completely comfortable with that and other people aren't. And there's no right or wrong with that. But we also just need to tune into like, what are my boundaries around this?
If you've had a physical boundary, or I guess any boundary, but it seems to be more obvious in physical, crossed in a really traumatic way, does that affect your ability? Is the boundary kind of broken in a way that's hard to fix, so to speak, moving forward?
Yeah, I think I'm a bit reticent to use the word broken because I think that often is an experience that trauma survivors will feel very strongly about, that they are broken because of what happened, and really highlighting exactly how truly painful that experience is. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's broken, but it's almost like it's recalibrated my understanding of my boundaries and my understanding of other people's boundaries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It has, like, particularly in childhood, that kind of violation has fundamental impacts on, like, even our neurobiology and our physiology, our, like, templates for understanding how people communicate boundaries, how people communicate our interactions socially.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
How aware, like we should be aware of our own boundaries, but how aware should we be of other people's boundaries as well?
That's a good question. I think this is way too simplistic of an answer, but I think in some ways it speaks to the heart of the fact that boundaries need to be communicated.
Mm-hmm.
So boundaries are not unspoken and they're not assumed.
Yep. So there's a bit of a responsibility for the person to voice their boundaries.
I mean, obviously, like, and this is so impossible, but in an ideal world, we could all communicate our boundaries so that it would all be out in the open. It would all be...
But it's so easier said than done.
100%. The likelihood of that happening is completely zero.
But even, like, I don't even know how I would, like, it almost seems like overkill sometimes to go, like, just so you know, my boundary is this. The other person, my fear would be that they would be like, oh, geez, all right. You're assuming that I'm going to cross it or something,
Yeah. I think the point would be, like, in a realistic manner, is that pointing it out when it's been violated, or pointing it out when it's getting to a point of it feeling uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Oh, and I feel so uncomfortable. I know I should, but I feel so uncomfortable about both those options of, like, saying it early or as it's happening. So saying you're crossing a boundary. I know I should be able to, but for whatever reason, it makes me feel very
It feels dramatic.
uneasy.
It feels like overly dramatic in a way that it shouldn't, but it can.
Yeah. So we'll come to talking about how we can communicate that, because you're right. I don't think we necessarily want to go, you've definitely just violated my boundary there.
Or we just carry around a buzzer. So it's like if boundaries cross, you can just press a buzzer. Like,
Someone said that to me, I'd be absolutely gutted to reference the business I mentioned at the start. But you'd just be shattered,
Yeah. So we're going to work with how we sensitively communicate that, which I'll come back to. But there are a couple of other domains where we can also see boundaries being important, and that's like our emotional boundaries and our almost like our cognitive boundaries too. So an example would be either oversharing or being the recipient of someone oversharing. So as a recipient of someone that's oversharing, we often start to feel uncomfortable. So that's a boundary for me that's being violated when I'm getting all of your stuff.
And I know oversharing is subjective, case by case, but like what, on one hand, someone might think it's oversharing. On the other hand, it might be like just sharing. Like, how do you know when you're oversharing?
Yeah. It's a really tricky question to answer. And in part, again, it has to do with what we've learned as children. And like, for example, you might be in a family where there was no privacy and there was no secrets kept, and we were asked all the time for exactly how I'm feeling. Those sorts of experiences tell us that in order to be close to someone, I need to share everything. Just as one example. So again, this kind of creates some sort of, like, we really have to be slowing down and paying attention to what is it that I'm doing. Look, just on the surface, I think the red flags for me, just as a normal person, would be when you meet someone for the first time and within 10 minutes you've heard about their divorce.
Yep.
There's a boundary violation that's occurring for both people, because I don't know this person yet, and this is already having an impact on me hearing all of this.
So what's the negative impact that then happens? Like, if you do overshare really quickly, what is the downside of that?
So if we kind of zoom out and have a look at, if you know someone that's like a chronic oversharer, is that often that feels just too full on for people.
Mm-hmm.
And so it often means that although it's like this unintended effort to make connection, it's actually pushing people away.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Yeah.
So like an example might be like even in an office context, the person that comes up to you at your office and is like dumping emotional stuff on you, there's a boundary violation. This stuff is for you outside of work. This stuff is not for me to hear when I'm at work. Does that kind of make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
Totally.
It feels so contingent on circumstance. I had a dentist once. I went to a dentist for a tiny bit before finding someone else to go to because
Was it Dad?
It wasn't Dad. For anyone, our dad was a dentist and this was not Dad. I went to this dentist and he started telling me all about how tough things were with the practice and with his family life at home and just like offloading all this stuff. In any other context, I would have been fine with it. But sitting in a dentist chair and having a dentist who's supposed to be, like in a professional medical circumstance, I did not want any of that. I was like, this is not making me feel comfortable. And I've never gone back to him because I'm like, oh, this is too much.
Great example. Yeah. And so your response is a feeling of aversion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, I don't know if this is boundary related, but I started to question his judgment.
Yeah.
if he feels like that's the way you should be talking to patients, I was like, not for me.
Yeah. There's like a sense of inappropriateness about it.
Yeah.
And even if we kind of use that as a word, like if you walk away going like, that was really inappropriate, there's a boundary crossing there. But the responsibility lies also with us in that, about how we, like for example, in a work context, I will come to this again, but in a work context, you've got your colleague that tends to overshare with you and it starts to interrupt your capacity to do your work. So like maybe they're taking up too much time or they're interrupting the flow or whatever it might be. The challenge is to stop there and go, I hear you. I've just got to get this out though. And so we have to find ways to really be honouring. There's this aversion feeling that's here when someone is doing this. There's this discomfort that's here.
Yeah.
I need to pay attention to that to assert and communicate my boundary.
Yeah, it's trying to do that in a way where you're not like embarrassing the person as well, because that would be my fear.
Yeah. People pleasing shows up massively in here, and the experience of guilt, which I again will come back to. But there are, certainly this kind of emotional domain of boundaries is a really important one. The other one that I think has relevance are our material boundaries. So things like you have someone borrow a jumper and they return it and it's got a stain on it. How do you communicate that boundary?
Oh, I mean, I feel like the easy answer is like just avoid talking about
Yes.
it. Never have any conflict in your life.
Exactly.
That would be
Avoid
great.
and cut off people. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's how we communicate what we'd like done with our physical possessions and our material possessions. Even things like you might have a boundary that people take their shoes off before they come into your house. And a new person comes to visit and they don't have that personal policy in their house, so they then walk in. And for you as the person that has the house, that's your job to communicate. Oh, we have a bit of a thing. Do you mind leaving your shoes at the door? That's you asserting you.
Yeah.
We had a friend over the other day and they brought their dog, which was fine, and it went upstairs and it weed on Elsie's carpet. And they're like, oh, whoops, sort of laughed about it. And they were cleaning it, but it was never a cleaning job. They never, and it's this permanent stain now on Elsie's carpet.
So do you
quite
have like a boundary though? It's like we have a bit of a thing in this house where we don't let dogs piss on the carpet. So can you make sure that doesn't happen?
I quite literally got my boundaries pissed on.
Yeah.
It just occurred to me that I feel like Curb Your Enthusiasm is just about boundaries.
Oh, well, there's a perfect example of it in Curb, which is the coasters on the good wood.
Yeah. Do you respect wood?
Yeah, do you respect wood? Because like coasters on a table is such a big one. But that's so true. It is about Larry's boundaries.
Larry's boundaries,
Yeah.
It's so true.
And other people don't have those same expectations. And this is the thing, is that we don't know what other people's boundaries are. And so it's our responsibility. It is our responsibility to express them in the best way that we can. Yeah. And I want to give you an example of how you know you have some issues with boundaries. So these are some of the common signs that you have issues with boundaries. You feel burnt out. That is the number one sign that there are issues with burnout here.
With boundaries here.
Sorry, with boundaries here. So if you think of Grant's episode, for example, you know, his exhaustion, his depletion that was here, that too much is being taken from me, and it's almost like nothing is protected. I'm so vulnerable here, and there's almost like a sense there of feeling used.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm.
So burnout is the biggest indicator for me, and in the research too, that we have had some struggles asserting our boundaries.
Yeah, makes sense.
The other one is resentment, one of the most common outcomes. So how many times, for example, have you done something you didn't want to do? You said yes to something that you really didn't have time or energy for, but you didn't communicate that you didn't have time or energy. And so you've done the job, maybe even in the lead up to that, feeling really pissed off that you have to do it. And then after you've done it, you find yourself complaining or bitching about the person that asked you to do the job.
Oh, yeah, common.
Yeah. The question then is, but did you express to that person that asked you to do the job that you were having trouble or you wouldn't be able to do it?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
If it's me, no way.
Yeah. So if we even to look at like the phenomenon of gossip and complaining, when we're gossiping, in some ways it's like a way that we're trying to process this discomfort, this frustration, this annoyance with, in essence, like a boundary being violated for us in some way. And so we gossip with someone else as a way to kind of process that feeling of resentment and anger and irritation. It doesn't do anything.
Oh, this feels very high school. Like this, like feels like this is the kind of, especially the gossiping behind the back of the person that you resent because they asked you to do the thing that you didn't tell them you didn't want to do, or whatever. That's such a common high school thing.
Yeah, I also think it's very common now too as adults.
Yeah, and then often though I find when it happens as adults, we go, oh, this. If you hear someone do it, I often think that is so high school. But it is. It's very common with adults as well. I mean, I do it all the time.
Yeah. So it's a way of avoiding the discomfort of approaching the person that we have the problem with.
Yeah.
Very true. It sort of links a little bit to one of the first episodes you ever did with us, which was Truth versus Harmony.
100%. Yeah. And that is also then the one of the other really common kind of red flags or indicators for boundary issues is when we really struggle with people pleasing and choosing harmony over truth. Yeah. And it makes so much sense when we are driven to seek approval, when we are driven to ensure that we're accepted. It's almost like we lose ourselves, it's almost like we abandon ourselves in order to please the other person.
Yeah.
But the consequence of that, like this chronic people pleasing, the consequence, to be honest, is burnout, resentment, frustration, and leads to us almost like fantasizing about disappearing, about going on a holiday with no one but myself. Does that resonate at all?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
I've been thinking recently that like a virtue that I would like to have more of and something that I really love in other people is flexibility. But I find it kind of complicated when laid up against the concept of boundaries. So flexibility in what way? Well,
touch your toes.
Yeah, physical. No. What would be an example? So made plans to do something. We're going to go to the zoo. The kids decide, which is very realistic, that they halfway through no longer want to go to the zoo. It's a change in the plan. It's a change in the structure of the day. I would love to be able to pivot really quickly and not have frustration about the change of plans or the whatever it is, but the flexibility to switch quickly in the moment and then really thrive in the new direction. And I feel like sometimes that happens, but if I look at that with boundaries, so someone's asking me to do something that I immediately go, oh, I don't know if I want to do that. Having the quick cognitive thing to be able to go through it quickly and go, well, what is actually the cost here if I could do all those things? yep, I can do all that. Let's change, and I can pivot and actually be flexible and enjoy something new and different that I haven't tried before, rather than relying on a rigid boundary that for whatever reason in the past had made me not want to do that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I think you hit on something really important in there, and that is that it requires pausing.
Yeah.
So it's sometimes tricky to unpack. Like, am I saying no to this because I actually feel anxious about doing it? That's a different thing, right? So if we're saying, no, I don't want to go to that social event because the thought of it makes me feel very anxious, that is different to me saying no because I don't have the time to go.
Yeah, that's true.
Right?
Yeah.
So, but both of them warrant us pausing and slowing down enough to check in before our answer.
Yeah.
So flexibility can come, but it doesn't have to be swift.
Yeah.
So we don't have to be immediately flexible. It's like, yes, I can do this. It's like, give me a second. I want to get back to you. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it might literally be one in-breath and one out-breath.
I love it. I love it when I do think to pause, especially if I'm asked to do something. If I'm in a certain mood, if I'm in like a really good can-do mood, I'm like, yeah, great, why not? Let's do it. And then a couple of days later, I'm like, why did I commit to that? Not because I don't necessarily want to go. It's just like I've got so much on that week. Why did I don't have to do that. Why did I commit to it? And then on the flip side, when I go like, when I have the peace of mind to go like, can I get back to you on that? And then I actually think it through, look at the schedule or whatever and go like, actually, that's not a good idea for me to do that. And then say, no, I'm so proud of myself.
Yeah. And it actually highlights, I think, some of the reasons as to why we don't set boundaries. And they're usually emotional-based reasons. And that is that for a lot of us, when the thought of even setting a boundary exposes us to feelings of fear and guilt. So if I don't do this thing, I would feel so guilty.
Yeah.
Or if I say I didn't like that, that might hurt the other person's feelings. Yeah. So I'm fearful of their response, and I'm really concerned that I would feel too guilty to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So fear and guilt are two things that we have to really kind of work with in order to be able to assert a boundary, express a boundary.
There's so much power in like just saying pretty quickly, I'll get back to you on that. I just feel like it's like that's a very nice stepping stone towards a no.
Yes.
I feel like I might do that, but then I leave way too much space from the I'll think about it and giving an answer. And then it becomes a cost on me.
Yes. It's moved into avoidance almost.
Yeah, it's moved into avoidance because I know the answer's no, but I'm too scared to do the no.
Yes.
Yeah. But that's the dream. I'll get back to you, and then a day later maybe the answer. Something to aim for.
I mean, I have to be honest, from a personal point of view, my dream would be to be able to have the ability to stand in that moment and say, I can't do that. Like what? When you hear that. But when you hear that from other people, how much respect does that engender? Like really?
There's a few people, there's very few, but there's like one or two in my life who I feel are quite good at this, and I love it. But they're just, when you ask them something like, I'm not doing that. No way.
Yeah. You know where you stand.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And then when they do want to do something, it's like they're 100% in.
Yeah.
And it's,
Yeah. And I think that really highlights the exact problem and the exact wonders of setting boundaries. And that is that when I set a boundary, I am giving myself the opportunity to show up in the parts of my life that I genuinely care about.
Yeah.
So when I say yes to these things, it means that I'm saying no most often to the people that we care about the most.
Yeah. So if you say yes to something you don't want to do, that at some point is a no to whoever's important to you. Yeah. Because you won't have that time with them.
Yeah.
And that no doesn't look like a really overt no. What it looks like is I've spent all day saying yes to people, giving to people, dropping things, going above and beyond at work, doing volunteer things at the school, responding to someone's text message, all this sort of stuff. Say yes. And then you get home and you have your kids and you're physically there, but you are so depleted. you're so depleted and you don't have the resources there to be able to show up with a resounding yes to the people that you love the most.
Preach, sister.
It reminds me, actually, Chrissy Swan, when she came on the podcast and she talked about when she decided she didn't like making the school lunches.
Yes.
And it was so liberating for her to be like, they're just going to buy lunches every day.
Yes.
And I'm just not going to do it anymore. It's like setting that boundary is like,
it's liberating.
Huge.
Yeah. And I actually was thinking about that episode also when I was thinking about boundaries, because she also, I think it was a phrase that she said, like, we're just not those people.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It's great.
And it's like really fully embracing, like, this is not my thing. It's okay if it's your thing. This is not for me.
Yeah.
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 So good.
Who was it who said, it might have been maybe Kemi Nekpal, in these situations, if you're not sure, it's like, if it's not a hell yes, it's a no.
Definitely. Yeah.
Feels like a chemi.
Yeah, feels like
Does.
Kemi to me.
Yeah.
And the thing that, like, I think Hamish had said, not on the podcast, but Hamish's really good thing is, if it was a no tomorrow, it's a no. Like, people say, oh, it's not for another 5 months. Could we get you to do this in 5 months' time? Don't, because then you always think, 5 months will probably never actually happen. So I'll just say yes. It always comes around.
Yeah, when do we ever get to 5 months away?
That's so far away. I'll be a different person by then. And, think about it, like, if it was tomorrow, would you be saying yes? If the answer is no, then it's probably a no as well, which is a nice thing to do as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think I have a clear sense of what my boundaries are. How do you sort of said a little bit about it before, but how do I go about working out what they are in a way that feels good as opposed to feeling, because I'm coming from a very much a people-pleasing, probably depletion model. How do I go? I find it very challenging to go from that to identifying what some boundaries are for me. Is there a way to start identifying what they are?
I think starting pretty basically your feelings tell you.
Yeah.
So when you start to pay attention to moments when you're feeling resentful, moments where you're wanting to avoid and run away, I think starting with like attunement to your feelings kind of gives us a clue as to what's happening here.
Yeah.
Yeah. It might even be simple things like sometimes in a long history of people pleasing, when the effort is spent so significantly on showing up for other people and working out what other people want, like I said before, we've abandoned ourselves in some ways. We actually find it really difficult to know what I like, what I want, how to make decisions. Often like indecisiveness is a really big thing that shows up.
I'm very
that kind of
indecisive,
resonating.
extremely indecisive.
Yeah. And so there's lots of stuff attached to that, like perfectionism, fear of failure, all that sort of stuff is tied into that. But maybe part of this is also because I've spent so long giving over to the needs of other people, I actually don't know what I want. I actually don't know who I am.
Yeah.
Does that resonate with you?
It does. It does. And it also, you hear that I feel a lot with people who are parents once their kids leave home. I've heard that quite a lot, that they're at this point where they don't know who they are because they've spent 18 or so years just focusing on other people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is why self-care is so integral when it comes to boundary setting. That, in fact, I think Nedra Tawwab, she actually makes it pretty clear that the root of self-care is boundaries.
So that sort of looks like I go and watch the sunrise every morning. Like, is that like commitment to things that are good for you and then not breaking that boundary? Is that?
Yes. And in some ways it's the protection of my time. It's also the protection of, like, a self-caring act would be, I'm going to stop you there. That's not appropriate. I'm going to come back to this conversation.
Oh, wow.
So it's not just self-care in the sense of like you go and have a massage or go for a walk. It's not about that. It's about that the assertion of boundaries is really this like enormous act of caring and being on my own side.
Oh, I see. Gotcha. Yeah.
So the act
the sunrise thing is not right. Scratch
well,
that.
you could say, like, for me, going to watch the sunrise is something that's very important in terms of my self-care. Holding on to the boundary there is important. So that's an act of self-care, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. But it might even be...
But protecting your boundaries is an act of self-care.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
And so this is what I think is so powerful, because I hear this a lot, is that I don't have time for self-care, or it's selfish. Self-care is selfish, right? The paradox is that the less you take care of yourself, the more selfish that is.
Oh, can you explain more?
Yeah.
Say more.
I mean, I've already kind of alluded to this, but basically, when I don't take care of myself, I cannot take care of anybody else.
Yeah.
This is like the old adage of put your oxygen mask on first. Yeah. But it is very much around, like, even if we think about the stress response, so when we get exposed to ongoing and chronic stressors, our depletion levels kind of start to increase. So we start to get more depleted. So if we're sitting in this chronic state of fight or flight all the time, we just simply can't show up to the people that we want to show up to with the same kind of empathy, curiosity, compassion, all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And I think that for a chronic people pleaser and someone that self-sacrifices a lot, I think it feels very important that we really emphasize that if you don't take care of yourself, you are being selfish. Because I feel like that kind of plays on like almost like tugs at the heartstrings that like, I cannot be selfish. Like a people pleaser, that would be the worst thing I could be, would be selfish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's almost like we reframe this that I'm not actually taking the self-care for me. I'm really taking it for other people. And that is okay.
Yeah. Which is true.
Yeah. Totally. And this comes also in terms of like how we communicate in conflict, how we communicate with like toxic work environments, how we communicate with friendships that aren't going well. It's not just I'm taking time out. It's how do I make the boundary? How do I tell you that that's not for me?
I mean, I can't think of a time I've really been in this scenario, but I can imagine if you were starting a new job in a new company and you're trying to make a good impression. You're in those sort of first few months, the trial period, and you don't want to ruffle any feathers and a boundary is crossed. I imagine it would be very, very hard to actually speak up and say something.
Yes. But it's also the ideal time to set your boundaries. And I say that because the earlier you set your boundaries in any context,
so relationship,
the easier it is.
Anything.
Yeah. So like even very simple things like you might be dating someone and you say things like, oh, I don't mind. Or, yeah, sure, I eat Indian. And you're like, I don't eat Indian. But you do it because, it makes sense. Like this is, again, like this like effort to gain acceptance or approval. But there's a moment there, abandoning myself.
Yeah, but the relationship example is so good because at the start you don't want to seem like you want to seem malleable, like you're up for anything.
Flexible.
You're flexible.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like, oh yeah, I love Indian. If you love it, you love it, don't you? Yeah, I love it too then. You want to seem accessible and you want to seem fun and you don't want to be a stick in the mud.
Easygoing.
Yes.
Easygoing.
Easygoing, yeah. There's a premium almost on easygoing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So then to be like, oh, I don't like Indian. The fear is that they'll be like, but Indian's my favorite food. And if you don't like Indian, then we can never work, which is mad when you think about it. But you do sort of think those things,
So I guess, what I'm saying there is that the earlier you can set the boundaries, the easier it is. So people know from the beginning, like, that's just how Emily is. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Plastic Emily.
One thing I find very challenging as far as boundaries go is when they relate to your kids and as being a parent. Because I feel like as a value, my number one principle and value is to be a good dad. But sometimes I feel like I just cannot commit. I'm exhausted, depleted, burnt out, and can't be the dad I want to be. But then I also feel this guilt every time I say no. Like I just need to find more energy here to be a better parent, to get through it. And I find it very hard, the idea of being a loving, accessible parent who my kids can come to at any time, which is what I'd love to be, and have a boundary there. Yeah. So what do you do?
Look, I think just off the top of everything, I just really want to add that I'm not a child psychologist. So I think that certainly someone could really go into a lot of depth around this. It's a really, really important issue. But it's an important issue because we're all humans and boundaries, I think it's Brene Brown actually that describes boundaries as being like the guardrails across a bridge. So the guardrails or like the things that you hold on to when you're crossing a bridge are there to keep you safe and to help you cross the bridge safely. Having no boundaries is like having no guardrails. And so in essence, that boundaries are creating a sense of safety both for myself and for my children.
Yeah, that's true.
And so when we're thinking about it, like setting boundaries with our kids, and this is really tough because in the same way that adults often don't like when a boundary's been set and they, for example, receive a no, like it takes longer, there's more discomfort, there's more of a negative outcome when they hear a no, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But even then, it occurs to me that, like I don't know if this is true, but I've heard many times, I think it is true, that kids respond, I've got 2 boys and I've heard it's more common in boys, but really respond well to boundaries, structure, rules, and a framework in which to operate rather than a sort of free range world where anything's possible. Yeah. And it occurs to me that boundaries can be a form of that, just a bit of structure and rigidity. It doesn't have to be taking something away from them. It's a structure for them to grow within. Yeah. Dad does this at this point. He goes to look at the sunrise, to use your example before, and that's just what he does. And that's just one of the idiosyncratic rules and structures of our house.
Oh, there are so many important things in there. And really, if we think about it, all humans ideally want predictability and we don't like uncertainty. So structure and routine provides our children with a sense of safety because this is predictable. Yeah. I know how Dad's going to respond here, whether good or bad. I know also that Dad goes out and does his own time. So that becomes normal. So the second part to that, and Lael Stone's talked about this too, is modelling to our children the priorities that we have for caring for ourselves. So when they see you go out to to go and watch the sunrise, they know that Dad is respecting himself. Not that they would interpret it in that sense. Yeah. But you're building into this template for them what it looks like to care for yourself.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. It's really good. A good way of looking at it rather than I'm being selfish, which is 100%. Goes back to everything you were saying before. So
they're soaking it all in. That's building their little template. Yeah. For understanding. Because, I mean, I know, Josh, that you want your kids when they're adults to know that it's absolutely within their rights and their obligation, in fact, to care for themselves.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a good reminder to reframe it in my mind is that. Yeah. I don't know if it's just me, but there's something, and I hope this isn't kind of offensive to the concept, but there's just something about the term boundaries that I get a bit icky about. Like I would never want to say the phrase, that's crossing my boundary or that's about, I don't know why, but I feel like I'm going to have to work hard on finding different language and ways of expressing this because I feel.
Feels formal.
Formal and I don't know, just feels not me at all. Yeah. So there's a challenge there to try and come up with language that I can be comfortable saying. Yeah.
So I think we can actually have a look at that now if you like. And that is, to be honest, I don't think I've really necessarily heard people say you've crossed a boundary. I don't think that is like a common kind of phrase that we need. We don't actually need to use that phrase. But we can actually distill it down to how I feel. So I think I may have mentioned this in the past, but have you guys come across I statements before?
Oh, it rings a bell.
Yes. Yeah.
So this is like if you were to go and do like assertiveness skills training, like this is a bit of a cornerstone of that. And that is that when we're trying to communicate assertively, we really want to take ownership over how I feel in response to the behavior or the action or the environment that is here that's causing me discomfort. So often we, in terms of communicating when we're uncomfortable about something, it will end up being complete passivity, so we don't say anything at all, and we also don't have really any kind of reaction. Or it'll be passive aggressive, so like, you want to leave the dishes out on the sink, I'll go and put the dish on your bed, which is definitely what I did to my brother once. So that's like passive aggressive. I'm not willing to communicate my discomfort, but I will show you through my withdrawing behaviour, right? So that's passive aggressive. Yeah. And then aggressive obviously is just like overt aggression, yelling, screaming, throwing things, that sort of stuff. But assertive communication is I felt frustrated when you left the dishes out. So it's identifying the feeling, because no one else can argue with how you feel about something. You take ownership over that.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of, you left the dishes out on the sink. What is wrong with you?
Yeah.
So often we move to accusatory language, which usually starts with a you. You did this. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So that's when it's moving into like more of the aggressive type communication as opposed to the passive or passive aggressive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So things like I need, I want, I would prefer, I would like to try doing this a different way. So we're not saying like, you've crossed my boundary, I want to do something different. It would be more something like, I don't know, Kelly, I'm feeling a bit stressed with the work that I've got to do at the moment. I hear what you're saying. It sounds really important. Let me come back to you at lunchtime.
Yeah.
I think I would be tempted to try and like get around that, like try and find a loophole by saying, instead of like the dishes, instead of saying, I don't like it when you don't do the dishes, my first thought is like, I would go like, you know what? I love it when you do the dishes. But that feels passive aggressive, isn't it?
Probably.
Yeah. Probably.
Yeah. So I really we want to think about it being clear.
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely how I feel, not what I would like.
Yeah.
You know?
And we can kind of say in the reverse. So when you left the dishes on the sink, I felt frustrated.
Yeah.
But regardless, we're looking at the behavior as being separate to the person doing the behavior. So I'm not saying you're so lazy, why can't you do the dishes? We're saying I felt frustrated when you left the dishes out. I would really prefer it if next time you could do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, the really important thing is with boundary setting is that we don't always get the response we would like. So being assertive does not result in us having happy responses. And I think that's the really tough thing about this.
Yeah.
People don't necessarily like to hear no.
And hard to do it again if the response is not what you want the first time.
Yeah. So that's what's really tough about this, is that we have to be open to the discomfort that comes with setting the boundary. So the discomfort of in the moment expressing my boundary, and also the consequences of that. The thing is though, if I was to assert my boundary that, I don't know, I'd really prefer not to talk about my personal life with my work colleague, for example. It's just not my thing. Like, I like to share lots of stuff with you, but it's just not my thing to talk about my relationship. Now, in that moment, that might feel really uncomfortable and the person could feel like quite offended, right? But what will happen then is you'll probably feel guilty. So you get exposed to this feeling of guilt, like that was really bad, I shouldn't have done that, and blah, blah, blah. But you might notice that person doesn't ask you again. And so what we get then is there's a comparison between the feeling of guilt that comes from having asserted a boundary versus the feeling of resentment when I don't assert the boundary. So we've got these two experiences here. One is acute in the short term, but the resentment, on the other hand, is so much more corrosive. So what we have to look at is how can we be okay with the feelings of guilt that show up, particularly for people pleasers? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yep.
And how can you? What's the answer?
I feel like we could maybe look, in my experience, we could look to neurodivergent people as the superheroes of this. They're very quick to tell you what their boundaries are.
Yeah. And how is that for you as the recipient?
It can be a bit jarring, but the response is you don't cross that boundary again.
Yeah. It's like we're actually giving a map to people to read us and to know how and where to walk, basically. Yeah.
There's a movie out at the moment, well, it might not be out by the time this comes out, but Poor Things, which is a film with Emma Stone. Very, very absurd film. Really, really great, but without spoiling it, a big part of it is Emma Stone's character, particularly for a big chunk of the film, is very childlike. And as a result, she just says what she's thinking at all times. She's just very honest and open, and often says things which are like, you can't say that, and it's quite offensive to people, and people are like shocked that she would say that, but she's just purely saying what she is feeling, what she does like, what she doesn't like. But yeah, it sort of made me think like, God, we're very rarely honest when we talk to people, and it really probably has a lot to do with boundaries and not wanting to be honest about our boundaries and people pleasing.
Yeah, we don't want to offend people.
We don't offend
Yeah,
people.
yeah. And I think for me, it feels like there's a really important acknowledgement in here that we can be sensitive and honest. So the honesty doesn't have to be brutal. It doesn't have to be and rude. We can still be sensitive to the other person's needs. And I also think it's important that we don't even have to be confident in asserting the boundary. I think we can say it feeling anxious. I think we can appear anxious when we're saying it. It's getting the voice out there, allowing the other person to know this is my experience. In part, that might even be acknowledging, you know what, this feels really hard for me to say. This feels very uncomfortable and against how I would normally work, but that doesn't feel okay for me.
Did you say, were we going to also talk about trespassing your own boundaries?
Yes.
Because I keep thinking of Missy Higgins. The Special 2 lyric?
What's the lyric?
You make boundaries you never think you'd cross.
Oh, yeah.
And when you wake up, when you happen to, you wake up completely lost.
I think, Ryan, you'd sing that so beautifully.
Probably, knowing me, knowing my range.
I think you would.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think, like, for me, what I hear when I hear that is how unaware we are. So in some ways, like this sense that like I set a boundary that I never thought I'd cross, but yet here I am crossing the boundary.
And you happen to,
yeah,
like as an accident, yeah.
Yes, and it almost tells me that, or it tells me about how much attention we're not paying. And again, like, I feel like I'm a broken record here. Mindfulness is not the answer to everything, but I think present moment focus has a lot to say here. Is that we so need to be in tune with ourselves, with the sensations in the body, with where the mind's going in order to know that I have a boundary and in order to know that it's been crossed.
Yeah. And then finding a way in that present moment to voice the boundary, but I guess like in a respectful, compassionate way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you can even, like, to be honest, you could even Google this stuff. There's everywhere, like assertive communication skills. But finding a phrase that feels comfortable for you. Even if someone says something that's rude to you, we don't have to come back with like an aggressive comment. It can be, you know what, that's just not for me. So find a statement that feels comfortable for you. We'd love to help you out. Just don't have capacity.
I was once at I won't say who it was, but I was at like a park and there were a few guys. There was like a picnic thing happening, a big group of people, and there was a few guys making some pretty like sort of misogynist comments essentially, and laughing about it, and like people were laughing, and then this girl that I know, she said, "That's lame," like, and shut it down perfectly, just like, "That's lame," and just stared at them. And then they stopped saying it.
Yeah.
It was just a great shutdown.
That's a great
From
example.
the same group, like friends from the same group.
Same group. Yep. Yeah.
And so there's so many different ways in which we can assert a boundary. That's a great example. There's a violation there of like her moral codes, for example, and like how she wants this world to be.
Yeah. Exactly.
I have to say that I have this memory of being at the football when I was about 15, and I was with my friends, and there were some people sitting in the row behind us who were being very racist, and I was very angry about it. But I imagine that you kind of all have this sense of me that I'm not like a very like outspoken kind of person, but it really, really upset me. And I turned around and I said something, and I said it with like the shakiest, like heartbeat in my throat voice, and I was like, there are kids around, la-di-da. And I felt so uncomfortable about it afterwards. I had to move.
Yeah.
I had to move, but it felt to me like that was a violation that was so clear to me that
Well done.
Yeah.
Thank you. I feel even anxious remembering it. It's quite funny. And I'm certainly not saying this as an example of like I'm standing up for people or anything like that, but more as an example that like even if you feel so anxious, you can withstand the feelings that are here.
Yeah.
And you can act in line with the values that you have, even though it feels really tough.
So boundaries and values really sit side by side, don't they?
They do. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So probably like once knowing what your values are probably does really help you know what your boundaries are.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
vice versa, probably.
And vice versa,
Yes.
maybe, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely. I think a question that can be helpful sometimes is to ask yourself, if I wasn't concerned about feeling guilty, what would I be doing differently?
Mm.
So if I wasn't worried about being pushed around by this feeling of guilt, or if I wasn't worried about their reaction, what would I be doing here?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
so
that's a good
then
one.
we know we can work with the feelings there, because most often, like I said, it's feelings of discomfort.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's great.
So I was talking to, well, no, I wasn't talking. My daughter, my 4-year-old daughter, was dancing around the house singing a song. And I was like, what is that song you're singing? Anyway, it's a song about boundaries. And unbeknownst to me, the wonderful childcare and kindy places are obviously now talking so much about boundaries, which we never had exposure to, like personal boundaries, physical boundaries, all that sort of stuff. And I was like, this is so wonderful. Like, I just felt like my heart was singing. Anyway, so I've recorded her singing the song. And if it's not too weird and inappropriate, I will play it.
That
Yes.
does not cross my boundary at all.
Please stop. I don't like that. I'm feeling uncomfortable. I need more space. Not around you. Don't take it personally. It's just a boundary. This a boundary.
Oh,
That's the best thing.
That was.
Yes. So if you don't take anything away from today, you can just listen to a 4-year-old instead tell you about your personal space and your boundaries.
brilliant.
Amazing.
She is her mother's daughter.
Wow.
Good stuff.
Done it again.
She's done it again. Unless you got more, Doctor.
I possibly do, but I think that's probably all my brain has got for today.
Well, fair enough.
There's my boundary. Oh my gosh, I didn't even realise I
very
did
good.
it.
Well done.
Yeah. Okay, there we go.
Well, God, I feel like I'm going to listen back to that number of times so I can impressively flash back to it in a later episode. But yeah, I think before we started talking today, my idea of what boundaries were was quite a small, narrow idea of what they are. It's so helpful.
That's
Thanks,
awesome.
Sam.
That's a pleasure.
Thank you, Em. Safe
you.
flight home.
Thank you.